Join us as we discuss the pros and cons of homeschooling an autistic child. We'll cover the benefits of personalized learning, socialization challenges, and tips for creating routines and incorporating therapies to help you decide if homeschooling is right for your family. Before we get started, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for reminders of upcoming streams. Let's get started. Hey, Embracers!
Welcome back.
We thought that it would be appropriate to talk about homeschooling given our last episode in our community. Ever since that incident happened, a lot of parents started considering homeschooling, ourselves included. And so we started thinking, well, what does homeschooling look like for autistic kids? And is that even a realistic option? So that's something that we wanted to touch on today. So one of the first things that we want to make sure we're discussing is why some parents might choose homeschooling. And I kind of touched on that. Babe, what are one of the reasons that you consider homeschooling for our kids?
Well, I mean, it's a lot easier to get on the same page if the same page is like you and me, essentially, like as far as like what we want to like teach them.
Yeah.
Because I feel like sometimes like with a school, like we might want like something a little bit more challenging for like in some areas and maybe a little bit more focus on others that they're kind of struggling with. So for like example, like our oldest daughter definitely loves math and is like obsessed. Like if you'd sit her down to do a workbook, she will stay on it like for 45 minutes or an hour, and she's in first grade. So she absolutely loves numbers and math and that whole thing. But like as far as like, because she's also in like a social group at school, and she kind of struggles a little bit more with that when they come home with like the worksheets. Some of those are a little bit off. So like it seems like it would be more beneficial if we're able to kind of focus on some of the areas that she struggles more, and then try and push to excel some of the areas that like she's like doing better at, and
Yeah.
being like in complete control of like the curriculum essentially.
Yeah. And I just realized we had a podcast first. My little slip, I actually called you babe on the podcast. So, all of
Is
you
that the
guys
first time?
watching live, yeah, I think so. In the 3 years that we've done this, everybody watching live, let me know in the comments. Should I include that in the audio podcast or should I edit it out? You guys let me know. Is it weird? But yeah, I think that that really is a big part of it is like personalizing the curriculum for our kids. So, our kids are probably I would consider them twice exceptional. The youngest one is a little young still for me to really know if she is. She's not super verbal with how she thinks. So it's kind of hard to know exactly where her, I guess, intellect level is. But because of that twice exceptionality, we particularly run into the issue of the curriculum is not necessarily advanced enough for them, but behaviorally and socially, they're actually delayed behind their peers. So, because of that, there's like this weird dichotomy of like they're advanced in certain areas, but delayed in other areas. So, there's not really a good fit for where they should be placed in school. Because if they skip any grades, they'll be with older kids that are more mature and they can't really handle that socially. But if they stay in their same grades, they have peers that are a little more where they're at. Honestly, they're probably still more advanced than them socially and behaviorally, but the curriculum is way, way too easy for them. So they get bored. And when they get bored, they have more behavioral outbursts. So that's something that we have kind of struggled with, and we have not been able to find a good path forward with the school system with it. So that's one of the things that has me considering homeschooling as a potential option for them.
Now, sweetie, I do have to
Honey buns.
yeah, yeah, we'll keep this going. I do need to say, like, originally, like, we weren't even on the same page, like, together on this. Like, originally, I was kind of against the idea of homeschooling, more so
Against. This
well,
was
not
like
like
one of our biggest first fights.
well, that's what I was gonna say, like, because, I mean, we make it sound like, "Oh, yeah, like, homeschooling's, like, the way to go," kinda thing, but, like, I've kind of sacrificed my perspective in pursuit of what is best for you and the
You
children.
came to the light. You
Let's
saw what was right.
right, but my biggest fear was essentially, and this is what I've always kind of thought, kind of in the back of my mind when I was growing up. I always had the assumption, like, if you're homeschooled because you're doing school at home, you're not around the 30 kids in your class, which I thought that might stunt like the socialization aspect because for that, however, I don't know how long a school day is, 6 hours or something? You're not around like those 30 kids. So I figured like, okay, you're not getting that like engagement with your like peers. And I do have to admit that is still a fear of mine because like homeschooling, it's just going to be like her and her sister. They're not going to be 28 other kids that they can socialize with. So I do really worry about that sometimes. But I feel like for the academic component, I feel like it's not like able to be matched based on what like the school is essentially offering.
Yeah, so I think that the socialization aspect is usually the first thing that people jump to when they are kind of like anti homeschooling, or at least their first concerns. And for me, I actually see it differently because, in my opinion, when they're at school, most of the time they're actually being told not to socialize. Like, usually you're in class sitting down, they want you to be quiet, listen, pay attention, do the task. And so, really, the socialization's happening during like recess or lunchtime. And I feel like those are things that you could easily replace in homeschool. You can take your kids to the playground, you can put them in some social groups that are like after school activity equivalents. So you can put them in like ballet, or you can do like local parks and rec sports. Pretty much anything that your school has, there is some sort of private version of that. Like you could even do private art lessons, whatever it may be, where you go to a physical location and there's a class with other students. So it doesn't have to be found just in the education setting to get that socialization. So for anyone who is concerned about that, there are other options.
And I feel like the thing that really, like, drove that one home for me was essentially, like, you, giving kinda your perspective, like, growing up in elementary school, and you're kinda saying, like, "No, my experience in elementary school was very different than my experience in elementary school as far as, like, kind of, like, any type of, like, peer isolation." And then I kind of reflected, I was like, "Oh, okay, yeah, like, if our kids are autistic, I might kind of I don't know, concede that ground to you because I mean, obviously you have a different perspective coming into the elementary school component than I had essentially.
That's true. My experience growing up as essentially undiagnosed autistic, I didn't know at the time I had any sort of neurodivergency. I was very much socially isolated by my peers. So I went to school. I mean, I did both homeschooling and I also went to school. And I remember every time I was at school, I wasn't socializing because kids didn't really want to hang out with me. Like I was kind of like the weird kid. So I would be spending all my recesses sitting down at the picnic table and I'd be like reading books, drawing pictures, maybe writing stories or something like that, and I could not socialize with peers because they just weren't interested. I remember I would even like invent games to play at the playground because for a brief moment, they would get interested in the game and they would want to play with me because I invented a really cool game. But as soon as they learned the rules and they figured out how to play it, they'd leave me again and go play with their friends the game that I invented. So honestly, that to me created more of a traumatic experience than had I not gone to school. So sometimes parents equivocate going to school with having social relationships and having friendships, but that's not really always the case for autistic kids. Just because they're physically in a building or physically at the playground doesn't mean they're magically and suddenly having friendships and relationships. That's still going to require some sort of work. And I feel like as a parent, I can help my kid more on that front at home where I can see their social interactions rather than behind closed walls, hoping that maybe somebody sees what's going on and will intervene on my kid's behalf.
And I was gonna say, like the private interactions, like we or social groups that we put them in, they have pretty much, I would say, like been flourishing. Like, I mean, we just today we had a what was it, a picnic party
It was like
at
a
like
church
a
picnic.
yeah, like and, our oldest daughter, she saw one of the other kids, who's probably like a little bit older than her, probably like 12, and she was so excited, and the other girl who was 12 was super excited to see our daughter because, like, our oldest daughter really looks up to her, so there's that vibe right there, so she feels kind of like a sense of, like, belonging, and even as we're leaving, like, our church, there were some kids that were, like, opening the door, like, waving and saying goodbye to them, so it's kind of like they have a sense of, like, community even though it's not in a school environment, essentially.
Yeah. And the other benefit to that is when you are at home and you're kind of creating these social opportunities for your kid through these extracurriculars, you actually have a lot more variety of options. And because of that, it may be that your kid, you find out, has an easier time socializing in, like, let's say, ballet than they do at recess. Maybe they're more interested in ballet. Maybe for some reason, that's the thing that opens them up. At school, you don't have those varied opportunities. You have very much the same routine. So you might not always find what is that thing that clicks. Whereas at homeschool, you can rotate different activities and maybe 9 out of 10 won't click, but that 10th one will. So I feel like for me, it just provides so much variety and opportunity that I think that it works best for us. But go ahead.
Oh, I was gonna say, plus, like, they all have that interest, like, the reason why they're there. So, like you mentioned ballet, they're all interested in learning ballet, so at least they have, like, that one core thing in common, and then from there, they can kinda branch out to if they wanna have additional conversations, but at least they have, like, one thing in common, essentially.
Yeah. The other thing that I've heard that parents worry about when it comes to homeschooling an autistic child is, well, what do I do if I don't have an IEP anymore? My kid's not going to get therapies, they're not going to get these supports. And in my opinion, I actually feel like homeschooling is a better idea when it comes to that because the intent of the IEP is to help provide your child with the supports and goals that they need to continue to do well in school. And honestly, at home, you don't need to fight for any of those. So, like at home, there are no IEP meetings where you have to make a case for why your kid should be able to get XYZ accommodation. You can just implement it. You can incorporate it. If your kid needs to have some sort of like wiggle chair, you could just get it and have them use it. You don't have to justify the need for it. Same with like IEP goals. You could honestly do that with your own private therapist. Like if you have an in home therapist, whether that be ABA, speech, OT, there are some that come home, or you could also go and do it in the clinic. But you can have them essentially accommodate the goals that you would have had in an IEP and just work on those privately. If you have an ABA therapist who comes to your house, while they cannot help you homeschool, they can help you work on some of those IEP goals essentially. So that is something that you can make up for and have way more control over if you did it at home.
And plus, I mean, as far as the IEP, like, therapists that are through the schools, it seems like every single time we have an IEP meeting and they have, like, therapists that are meeting with them, each time they're trying to reduce the amount of time that our kids are even able to see them. So, I mean, you're right, at least you get away from having to fight for every single minute that our kids would see, like, a PT, on site, at the school, because, I mean, we all know that they're never trying to throw more hours and time that they're interacting with the, like, physical therapist or the speech therapist at the school. They're always trying to reduce time. It never goes the other way. So I mean, if you're able to obviously get those therapies privately, then you can kind of already keep those in place, and you're not really having to essentially fight for the additional resources.
Yeah, and if you're able to have your in-home therapist, that's like having a para, a one-on-one para. Like you have all that attention focused to your one child without having to fight for those resources with other kids. The other thing that's really helpful is if your child is kind of like ours, where their attention is kind of all over the place too, they can also get that one on one time to really help keep them focused when it comes to the curriculum. And you can incorporate movement if you need to. Like, I know schools have a really hard time with that one because our youngest, she is very gross motor and she has a really hard time concentrating if she has to sit still. But there's certain activities that require you to sit still at a desk. I am actually really good at creating inventive solutions to those activities where she doesn't have to sit on a desk. So if she has to do some sort of task, let's say she's doing math and we're saying, 2 plus 2 equals. A lot of times teachers think that that requires them to sit at a table to do that. And I don't think so. For me, I'm like, okay, let's do this as like a jumping activity. You're going to get on your trampoline. You're going to jump 2 times plus 2 more. How many times did you jump total? So that way she's incorporating movement while also doing math. And she is way more receptive to that. Like I've had a lot of success with having her focus when I have her physically moving, counter to what many people would think. It actually helps her.
And I was gonna say, I mean, even, something as simple, I mean, if you don't have, like, a trampoline, I think, the other time you were in, like, the kitchen on, like, a whiteboard, essentially, and instead of her sitting at the table where she's constantly wiggling and wanting to stand up, you have her standing in the kitchen with you, and you just use, like, a whiteboard to do the same math problem that she would be sitting at the table doing, but because she's able to stand up, kinda dance, wiggle, do whatever she wants, she's able to stay focused on what the question actually is.
Exactly. The other part of that is the flip side where there's like sensory overload, for example. So, our oldest, I think I mentioned previously, she has issues with like the cafeteria being too loud. And before using her earmuffs for that, she would get really overstimulated and she'd end up throwing like her food and everything on the floor. That was before we found out that she needed the earmuffs. So, what we can do at home is we can make a sensory friendly eating environment for her, where we don't even need to worry about her wearing earmuffs because we just have a quiet space for her to have her meal. We don't have to worry about the echoing and all the kids talking in the cafeteria or whatever it may be. She has a nice, quiet, cozy space, and they have sensory corners in the room if they need them. So you have complete control over the environment as well. So, in addition to the accommodations, in addition to your IEP equivalent, you also have the environmental control, you have access to therapists in your home, you have personalization of curriculum. There's so many benefits, in my opinion, to homeschooling.
And then the other thing is, like, at the end of the day, we're not, like, holding our phones or, like, waiting to see, like, how did the kids do at school? Because sometimes we'll get, like, a message or they'll come back in their folder, it'll, like, have, like, a color based on how they did for the day, and then it's always kind of the fear of, like, okay, hopefully the kids had, like, a good day at school because that really impacts their behavior at home, because it carries over after school, but if you're able to kind of maintain a constant routine at home, and obviously we're I feel like more capable or able to recognize their behavioral challenges at home more so than some of the teachers would. Plus, we don't have to contend with the other 20 plus kids. So we're able to do more one on one and be able to resolve any hiccups in like behavior or challenges that they face throughout the day. So hopefully, more days will be more kind of like even keel, essentially.
Yeah. And one of the things that people don't really consider is if you have like a twice exceptional child like ours, or maybe you have a child who's on the opposite end and maybe they're more behind their peers. With homeschooling, you have complete control over the pace of the academics. So if your child needs to slow down because something's a little too hard for them, you don't have to worry about them trying to keep up with their peers. You can break down the curriculum to their pace and their rate and help really give them the one-on-one time they need to catch up. Or on the opposite end like that, if your children are like ours, they might need more thrown at them at a faster pace. And if that's the case, there's nothing stopping you. Like they can get done with a week's worth of work in a couple days, then so be it. You can keep going and chugging along, and you don't have to feel like your child is being held back in order to wait for the rest of the class to catch up. So that's something that we in particular are looking forward to because that does feel kind of like our kids go into this like brain drain, which again impacts their behavior and then impacts the reports that we get at home.
And then kind of, with mentioning the brain drain, essentially because you can set the schedule for your academic school year, if that's what you want to call it, during the summer, you don't have to necessarily worry about regression if you're planning on kind of doing like a like year-round homeschool environment. So obviously we can still take the breaks throughout the year as we need them or see them, but it's not like a huge like 3 month like gap during like the summer. We can kind of make it more flow more natural, so they can get breaks periodically throughout the year, but we don't have to worry about like a regression at the end of the year because of like the summer.
Yeah, and you make a good point because we always see regressions over the summer. And this past summer, we saw huge behavioral regressions, which I don't know if you've noticed, but they certainly improved once we were back in the school routine. So if we do that whole year round school rather than having like a summer break, that's another way that I think we'll see behavioral improvement with them by homeschooling them throughout the whole year.
Yeah, I think
Um,
so too.
but with that said, there are some concerns, there are challenges with homeschooling. One of them, as I mentioned, that's frequently mentioned is the lack of socialization opportunities. So even though you'll have the opportunity to reduce sensory overload, there is limited social interaction with peers. So they won't be seeing the same amount of kids the same amount of time. It just won't ever be at that level because schools have like 1,000 plus kids, and you're just not going to have that same level of access. But again, this is something that you can adjust for by putting your kids into activities and clubs through your local park and rec and things like that. But just keep in mind that it's never going to be at that level. It just depends on how much you really need that. Like for me personally, I'm more of a quality over quantity person. So I'd rather have higher quality, smaller social groups than high quantity acquaintance that your kid doesn't really hang out with. But, that's very independent. Like every parent might have a different opinion on that.
Yeah, I think of, like, as far as, like, when I was in elementary or middle or even high school, after, like, the school year's over, like, you might maintain friendships with, like, a handful of people, but I feel like most of them, like, it's kind of necessary based on, like, the classes you have, so you might have a great friend in, like, 1st grade, but then next year you're in a different class with them, and you don't really see them, and then, okay, we were friends in 1st grade, but now 2nd grade, like, we're no longer in the class, we don't really hang out, we're more acquaintances. And I mean, that just kind of is just kind of fluctuating through the years anyway. So I feel like it might not even be as impactful maybe if you're already seeking out these outside places where they can socialize anyway.
Yeah.
So they might already have the friendships in those independent social groups, and then you keep those throughout the year. So it might serve the same purpose.
Yeah, I actually feel what's probably going to be a bigger challenge and more likely challenge is the parental time and energy invested, as well as financial and logistical concerns. So, homeschooling requires a lot of time commitment from the parent. So, if you are like us and you're working full time jobs, it might be difficult to homeschool. So that was really one of the things that was really holding us back is that we both work full time, and so we're just thinking to ourselves, like, how are we going to do this? How are we going to be able to homeschool them and work full time and take care of a baby, et cetera, et cetera. But at the end of the day, we just felt like we have to. Like at this point, we just feel like what happened at Appalachia kind of changed our perspectives a bit. So we probably are going to move forward with that at some point, anyways. But it is a real concern. And the other one is the financial and logistics. So a lot of these homeschool curriculums cost money. There are some that are free. So, for those of you who might want to homeschool, there are free options out there, but a lot of them do cost money. So, it just matters if you are willing to commit to the financial um, commitment of it, or if you are okay with going with like a free version, whatever it may be, just the fact that money is going to be an issue potentially. And then, of course, the last one is that lack of access to specialized services. This is very dependent on where you live. So, if you're in the United States, different states and different counties even have different regulations for what a homeschool student is allowed to have. So, I know back when we lived in Maryland, at the time before our kids were of the appropriate age to get the services, they actually did allow like speech therapy for homeschool students. And we were going to sign them up for that. But at the last minute, they basically passed a new law that kind of retracted that. So now they no longer offer any sort of therapies for homeschooled students. So that varies by county. So you would have to look into your local county and see if they do allow any sort of homeschool student therapies or not. But you would have to travel to the school regardless if they offer it or not.
And I think the school does offer or well, I mean, we'll have to check as well. I think as far as what is it, extracurricular activities, I think there's some overlap there as well, right?
Yeah, so another thing that is very county and school and state specific that you can look into is many places still offer homeschool students access to extracurricular activities and sports. So, our county and where we live, they actually do allow, I think, I think starting in middle school and up, they allow homeschoolers to try out for the school sports teams and they allow them to join the after school clubs and activities. So if your county has those rules in place as well, your homeschool child might still be able to be involved in those social opportunities. However, those don't tend to start, at least in our area, until middle school. So at least in elementary school, you will not have access to that.
And I don't honestly remember a lot in elementary school when I was going through. I think most of them I thought started after or started in middle school and beyond as well.
Yeah. I think they usually start, like, in 5th grade, like, the last year of elementary
Yeah.
school. But, yeah, that's pretty typical for these things not to start until middle school anyway. So it's definitely something to look into. Again, this is all really about weighing the pros and cons. The other downside is if you are, like, in a single parent household, homeschooling might not be possible for you. Like, if you have a full-time job and you don't have childcare, it just might not be possible. Some states allow you to like hire a tutor and they're allowed to homeschool on your behalf. Some states that's illegal and you can't do that. So again, you have to look into your specific state's homeschooling laws and see what you can and can't do, and then just go off of your gut and see what you feel might work best for your kid. But the best thing is nothing is permanent. So if you want to homeschool, you can always withdraw your child. Most states, you just have to submit a letter of intent to homeschool. You can withdraw them, start homeschooling. And if you feel like it's not going well or you can't handle it, it doesn't even matter what time of the year it is. You can always re enroll your kid into the public school system. You'll have to file paperwork, but you can always go back. It's not like a permanent one way decision. Same thing goes the other way around. If you decided to leave them in school and then you just said, this isn't really working out. I wish I had gone with my gut and homeschooled this year. You can also withdraw in the middle of the school year if you need to and submit your letter of intent to homeschool. So that's just something to consider for those of you who don't really know one way or another which way you're leaning.
So in 12 months, for example, if we have another episode saying homeschool didn't work out, we're back in school. So that's what
Well, we
happened
haven't even
now.
homeschooled yet,
Well,
so
that's what I'm
the first
saying, like,
one.
in 12 months, if we have an episode where we're updating about our homeschool situation, that is what that is in regards to.
Yeah, we'll come back and then everything will be on fire. We'll be like, "Don't do it. Don't do it, guys."
Uh,
Yeah, so that's just something that we're considering, I would say, pretty strongly at this point. But honestly, I think that the benefits kind of outweigh the cons. I think that homeschooling at the end of the day really offers a flexible, individualized approach to education that a lot of autistic children would thrive in. In my opinion, it's almost like having like the ultimate IEP. Like you basically can get anything and everything you could wish for your child. The only thing is that it's on your dime. It's not on the therapist's dime. It's not on the school's dime. But oftentimes you can get a lot of these supports through your private paid insurance or your state Medicaid. So that's still helpful. The other thing is that a lot of people think that, there's going to be those challenges with socialization. But in my opinion, I do think that there's a lot of ways around that nowadays.
yeah, so I think it's worth considering if it's feasible based on if it's feasible based on your own situation at home. So if you're able to manage the schedule of homeschooling as well as working, as far as the flexibility, are they still able to go to any type of social activities outside so they can still get the practice socializing with their peers? So it's not complete isolation. It might definitely be something to consider.
Yeah, and the other thing is that homeschooling isn't always like a one size fits all thing, meaning it could work for one of your kids and not for the other. So just because you tried it for one and it didn't work for them doesn't necessarily mean it wouldn't work for the other. So we have two kids, they're both autistic. It's very possible that we try homeschooling them and one of them is thriving in homeschool and the other one just can't do it. If that's the case, I personally don't have any problem with leaving one of them in school while the other one's homeschooling. I'm really flexible and I just want to do what's best for my kid and what will benefit them the most at the end of the day. So I would just say like go into education with an open mind. Don't feel like you have to do the standard. Our kids are not standard, so we have to be flexible and be willing to adapt. And I think that at least being open to the idea or the possibility of homeschooling is beneficial for our kids.
And one of the things about the flexibility is, I think even now, they have what, like the co-op,
Homeschool
homeschooling, like
co-ops.
umbrella
Yeah.
or whatever they call it. So it's not just like it's just you and that's it. If you needed like additional like groups to meet with or to like try and connect with, I know a bunch of areas have like other homeschoolers that are kind of like connected in like a like network or web where you are able to kind of like work with them and do different activities or whatnot in the process.
Yeah. And one last thing, one of the things that I've heard with homeschooling is the stereotype of the homeschool kid, and they try to scare you by saying like, "Oh, if your kid homeschools, they're gonna be this antisocial kid. They're gonna be kind of like the weirdo. They're not gonna know how to socialize." And I actually, in reflecting upon it, was thinking, that might be a whole chicken or the egg scenario where, in my opinion, I think that really comes from the fact that most neurodivergent kids probably gravitated toward homeschool, or their parents gravitated towards homeschools because schools were not accommodating enough, or essentially they weren't really included in the school setting appropriately. And because of that, I think that it probably outnumbers neurotypical kids in homeschooling. Like, you probably have more neurodivergent kids being homeschooled than neurotypical. So that gives this like false impression that the homeschooling is causing the antisocial behavior, when in fact it may just be that a lot of these kids are already autistic, therefore they already struggle with socialization. So I think that I am cautious about thinking that it's the homeschooling itself, rather than the lack of having the appropriate supports in school makes it so that kids who struggle with socialization have basically no recourse but to homeschool.
Yeah, that is an interesting perspective. I mean, and honestly, not one that we would know which caused what. But it is something to keep in mind that that could very easily be the reason why there is kind of that negative like stereotype towards like the homeschooling kid essentially.
Yeah, so don't let it get you down. So ultimately, the choice to homeschool or not will really depend on your child's unique needs and your family's specific situation. But just remember that, there's no one size fits all and there's no one solution. So as long as you are okay with adjusting as you go along, everything should be fine. And at the end of the day, you know your kiddo best. So go with your mama gut, go with your daddy gut. Don't let other people tell you otherwise. You know what's best for your kid. And
Never
with
heard of
that,
oh
daddy
god.
gut?
I was gonna say I've never heard of daddy gut before.
Yeah, well, that's because the mama gut usually supersedes it.
Oh. Oh my gosh. I was thinking of like daddy gut as far as like the food you ate, but okay. Sorry.
So thanks for joining us today, and if you found this episode helpful, please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or share it with somebody that you think might benefit from the content. Don't forget to share your thoughts on homeschooling by joining the conversation in our Embracing Autism community, or you can leave us a comment on YouTube and Facebook at Autism Wish. Let us know what you think. Are you for homeschooling, against homeschooling? Are you considering it? Do you think it would help your kid? Do you think it would worsen the situation? Are you worried about therapies? Let us know anything and everything about homeschooling, because we have still not committed. You can still change our minds.
There we go.
All right. Don't forget to follow us on Facebook as well at Autism Wish. And you can find us on YouTube and Instagram at Autism Wish as well. Have a good one, everyone. And we'll see you next week.
All right. Bye.
Bye.